Not everything that is faced can be changed. But nothing can be changed until it is faced. These words by James Baldwin, American writer and activist, inspire us to speak about matters that require reform, that require change. And it seems to me that in the last 5-6 years, since we had what one might call famous or infamous single national curriculum, a lot of discussion about education, a lot of facing of educational challenges have happened. आप देखें न्यूज़पेपर्स में जो आर्टिकल्स आते हैं, जो टेलीविज़न पे प्रोग्राम्स हैं, रेडियो पर शोज़ हैं, लिटरेरी फेस्टिवल्स पे एजुकेशन पर जो बातें होती हैं, इस किस्म की कॉन्फ्रेंसेस होती हैं, शायद इससे पहले इतना ज़्यादा एजुकेशन पर हमने पब्लिकली बात नहीं की. एंड दैट इटसेल्फ इज़ अ वेरी गुड थिंग, बिकॉज इट इज़ अलाउइंग अस to speak, to bring out different dimensions of it. And I see this very conference today as part of this very discourse. And not just another element, but something that is adding and asking new questions. So I would like to begin by thanking the Teach for Pakistan for organizing this conference and for inviting me and giving me this honor to share some thoughts with you today. आप सबको देखकर इससे पहले आई वॉज वॉचिंग द वीडियो एज वेल, फिर खतीजा ने जो बातें की, इट इज़ ऑब्वियस दैट दिस इज़ वन ऑफ द बेस्ट ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस इन एजुकेशन दैट वी हैव. और जो चीज़ मुझे सबसे ज़्यादा इंस्पायर करती है, एक तो ये कि जिन कॉन्टेक्स्ट में जाके आप काम करते हैं, दिस वाज अमेजिंग. और दूसरी चीज़ ये कि पीपल, द बेस्ट माइंड्स who choose to go in other fields other than education, you inspire them and bring them into teaching and education. Not only that, but I'm told that 75% of those who come to teaching through Teach for Pakistan then stay either in teaching or broader social development field. That's a major achievement. That's a brilliant achievement that is there. Thank you very much for that. So आज की जो कॉन्फ्रेंस है, अभी हमने सुना, the point is that बहुत कुछ हो रहा है. There is no doubt. One can list hundreds of projects here and there, all provinces, छोटे छोटे गाँव में भी, बड़े शहरों में भी. And I think there is some things that we can be proud of. There are many things that we have done well as well. And yet, overall, we continue to feel that the malaise is still there. And when we particularly compare ourselves to nations of similar profile, we find that things are not moving as fast and as much as they should be. So what to do? What next? And that is the question that this conference has thrown at us. And its possible solution that is being offered is that alongside the piecemeal, there's no harm in piecemeal efforts to continue. We need a systemic approach. We need to look at the education as an organism which is interconnected to each other in these different parts, and all of them have to be tackled together so that we can move forward, challenge the inequities, and provide educational opportunities for all and not just for the 5% that we are doing right now. I think by and large I would agree with this. This is a very reasonable idea. And I would like to say few things, perhaps problematize one or two ideas and extend some things for your consideration. And I wish to make 3 points. 3 चीज़ें कहना चाहता हूँ. पहली चीज़ मैंने ये की, जब मुझे ये इन्विटेशन मिला और हमने बातें की कि करना क्या है, I looked at the history of education in some countries. Because history से हम अक्सर सीखते नहीं हैं, लेकिन कुछ सीखा जा सकता है. So I looked at few countries who we consider as having very good education systems, कि भाई कैसे उन्होंने अप्रोच किया था, how was reform done there. Now, there are some countries where there was revolution. Cuba as an example. Cuba has very good education system. वहाँ वो immediately, because it was a revolutionary, और ईरान में भी 79 में, very different ways, but दोनों revolutionary, they immediately jumped to a systemic change, because as a revolutionary force, they wanted the entire thing to be changed at one go. So you found that. But then there are other countries जहाँ चीज़ें gradually move हुई. Let's take England as an example. England में for centuries it was the churches who were providing education. The state became active in the 19th century. And initially in gradual piecemeal manner. 1830s they had the first teacher education interventions. 1870 में एक bill pass हुआ बहुत मशहूर Foster's Act, which was the first time that state created schools जहाँ church की schools नहीं थी. 1880 में they made it compulsory that every child between age and 5 and 10 will be in schools. 1916 में they made it secondary school as compulsory. And it was only in 1944 through Butler's Act that what we today call systemic approach, where wholesale change was done, was put in place. So piecemeal से शुरू करके they reached a point where they realized that a systemic approach has to be done. Finland, another country we often talk about, more recent than England, it's actually 1960s and 70s when they took a major step to overhaul the entire system. कहने का मतलब ये है कि ऐसा लगता है चाहे रेवोल्यूशनरी फॉर्म से एजुकेशनल चेंज आया हो या ग्रेजुअल बेसिस पर आया हो, एट सम पॉइंट अ नेशन रियलाइजेस दैट इट नीड्स more than just individual parts to be changed, but the entire system needs to be looked at. And perhaps we are at that stage. Let us see what this day brings to our notice in that regard. But there was another thing that I noticed. वो ये कि जब भी ज़्यादातर कॉमन ने सिस्टमिक अप्रोच की तरफ जाने की कोशिश की, तो they realized they need some architecture plan. They need some thinking. बिकॉज एक प्रोजेक्ट तो आप एक दिन में बैठ के डिज़ाइन कर सकते हैं, बट व्हेन यू आर थिंकिंग ऑफ दीज डाइवर्स सिचुएशंस, चैलेंजेस, उनके लिए आप प्लान करना चाहते हैं. सो व्हाट वी रियलाइज इज दैट ऑफन दीज कंट्रीज हैव क्रिएटेड सम काइंड ऑफ इंडिपेंडेंट टास्क फोर्स और कमीशन एंड देन committed themselves to the findings of those commissions. For example, A Nation at Risk was a major report in 1983 in the USA. आज हम इंडिया में IITs की बात करते हैं, they are world famous, 1950s से शुरू हुए थे, but they actually came out of the recommendations from a report, सरकार report उसको कहते हैं, जो 1948 में create हुई थी. So you have many examples of some of the very successful interventions that happened. Their roots were in this thinking process where they created an independent and inclusive body, a task force, a commission, और फिर उनके recommendations को commit किया. And I think that's the first point I want to make, कि one of the things we might want to do as we want to move towards systematic reform is to create a body that will do this thinking in consultation and then cross-party, cross-power, make a commitment कि इनकी recommendations को 10 साल की हों, 15 साल की हों, हम फुलफिल करेंगे. बिकॉज यू नीड द राइट काइंड ऑफ लार्जर थॉट टू गाइड द लार्जर चेंज दैट वी वॉन्ट टू डू. सो दैट इज द फर्स्ट थिंग आई विश टू मेक. द सेकेंड थिंग इज what will be the purpose of this change? What will be the purpose of education? क्योंकि मेरा ताल्लुक फिलॉसफी ऑफ एजुकेशन से, तो ये क्वेश्चन हमेशा मुझे बड़ा पसंद आता है जी. व्हाट्स द पर्पस, व्हाट्स द पॉइंट ऑफ दिस? व्हेन आई वाज डूइंग माय PhD at Oxford, they call it DPhil there. I attended a course on philosophy of education by a professor called Richard Pring. He died last year. He was one of the best philosophers of education. तो क्लास के दौरान उन्होंने एक बात कही जो उस वक्त तो इतनी समझ नहीं आई, बिकॉज इट वॉज बिट ऑफ काउंटर इंट्यूटिव थिंग जो उन्होंने कही थी. ही सेड कि लुक, more damage to the world has been done by educated people than by the uneducated and unlettered. अब immediately तो आपको लगता है ये कैसी बात कर रहे हैं, because we are all conditioned to think that education is a wholly good force and it's a positive force. But if we pay little attention, we'll see that education in the sense of going to school, getting great grades, having literacy, learning, universities, degrees, is no guarantee that you will end up doing more harm than good. सोचें ना ज़रा, करप्शन को ले लें, फाइनेंशियल करप्शन हो कॉर्पोरेट लेवल पे या पॉलिटिकल लेवल पे, it cannot be done, mega corruptions, without a team of people in background in taxation, in finance, in law, supporting it. हो ही नहीं सकता. हमारे यहाँ पानामा पेपर्स की बहुत बात हुई थी. उसके बाद एक और लिस्ट आई थी. एक तो लिस्ट थी कि भाई कौन कौन थे, फिर एक और लिस्ट आई थी कि कौन से इंस्टीट्यूशंस इन्वॉल्व हैं. एंड इफ यू लुक एट द लिस्ट ऑफ इंस्टीट्यूशंस, there were finance companies, there were legal companies, there were others. और अगर उनके लोगों के आप नाम देखें, बहुत बड़ी बड़ी यूनिवर्सिटीज से उनके पास डिग्रीज थी, but they were involved in that. Some of the research that happens on how to kill, creating more and more sophisticated arms, वो कौन करता है? पढ़े लिखे लोग करते हैं. इसराइल की सोसाइटी पढ़ी लिखी है. Holocaust 1930s में Germany was educationally most advanced in Europe at that time, and then we saw Holocaust. So the point is that education, though major achievements have happened, but we cannot take it for granted that when we go through that system of school, college, universities, it necessarily means that we also become a morally good person. Aristotle said, educating the mind without educating the heart is no education. Educating the mind without educating the heart is no education. Today, I would say actually it can be a more harmful thing to do. And that is why I am sometimes concerned. इसको मैं मूव कर सकता हूँ? नेक्स्ट स्लाइड पे जा सकता हूँ, if it's possible. जी, I am sometimes concerned because the idea of learning in a very narrow sense has become very central to the discourse. For example, एक major report जो recently आई थी, this is what it said. It said, education systems must commit to learning as their central purpose, and this commitment must animate all other decisions in the system. COVID के बाद भी there was a huge discussion about learning losses. But when you ask what does learning mean in this context, you often find that it's a very narrow definition. 3 या 4 सब्जेक्ट लिए और कहा जी कोविड के बाद बच्चे इन 4 सब्जेक्ट्स में नीचे हो गए, so learning losses हैं. But we never asked, was there anything that children gained in those 2 years, 1.5 years? I know kids in my own family, others, who developed more closer relationship with their parents and family members, who learned some vernacular language, who learned some new art, or how to cook, or how to do some agricultural work. 1-2 जगहों पर हमने थोड़ा सा काम किया तो बच्चों ने कारपेंट्री सीख ली थी या मैकेनिक्स का काम सीख लिया था जो उनके घर वालों को आता था. But all of these learning gains were never in our preview because we had defined learning in a very narrow sense of 3-4 subjects, and we said learning loss hai, therefore it is. And that is my concern. कि I think when we make learning in that sense, and आप देखें almost all our reforms are around science, maths and English, because these are consumer subjects, these are economic subjects. And I think therefore what happens, which I'm trying to graph here, that the economic aim of education then takes over dominates all other aims of education. And when that happens, when the heart and soul has not been educated alongside the mind, you can end up with what my professor was saying, that educated people can end up doing more damage to the world than people who are not educated. And I think so my second plea, my second request when we move towards systemic education is that we must have an education that is both an education for the mind and education for the heart and soul. Therefore, the humanities as much as the science and technology. Particularly so now because there is a possibility and sometimes a tendency to believe that just by bringing technology and letting technology do the job, we are going to solve the problems. We may not be able to do that, and we may even be surprised by the results if there is a disproportionate emphasis placed on one side and we miss out on the nurturing of the heart and the emotions and the empathy and the care that we must do. So that's my second request, moving in that direction. Now my third point, and I come back to the main concern of the conference, that it is the educational reforms that have not worked and that we must take a systemic approach. A question that I would ask is, why have they not worked? A few years ago, I came across a number, a statistic, which in the last 1 year has become even more significant for me. And the number was the literacy rate in Palestine, Gaza and West Bank. You know what the number is? What is the percentage of literacy? 97%. 97%. Gaza, in that small area, had more than 20 higher education institutions, all now destroyed. And it forced me to ask that if a society like Palestine, with all its challenges, can have 97% literacy rate, can have schools and higher education systems, and not just them, but many other countries with almost similar profile in terms of demography and region and geography as Pakistan, can do much better. Why have we not been able to do? And I am forced to conclude that perhaps the reason is that our challenge and our problem that we often see in technical terms, कि जी exam system सही नहीं है, teachers qualified नहीं है, officials move हो जाते हैं, curriculum outdated है, structure सही नहीं है. These are all technical issues. But I am forced to think that perhaps our problem is not just technical but political as well. By that I mean a divided political will where half the country like this wants to educate and the other half either doesn't want to educate or give a very poor education to continue its domination. अभी लास्ट 2 दिन इस्लामाबाद में एक कॉन्फ्रेंस हुई जिसके बड़े चर्चे हुए रिलीजन एंड एजुकेशन के ऊपर, गर्ल्स एजुकेशन को लेके, और उसका एक रेजोल्यूशन भी आया है. I think it's a matter to applaud. It's a very good thing that that conference was done. An emphasis was put on girls' education with a particular emphasis that Islam is pro-education and there's a whole resolution there. But आप सोचें 21st century में हमें ये conference organize करनी पड़ रही है. Is that itself not an indication that in the society there are forces, there are significant groups who are not comfortable with girls' education? और अगर आप resolution पढ़ें ना जो अब आ गया है, so you will find that there are many points in the resolutions that are to counter those. वो recognize कर रहे हैं कि there are such groups who are not with education, and almost they are saying that from our perspective they are outside the pale of Islam. But my point is that the fact that we had to this conference itself is very revealing. And of course, it's not just the some religious groups that are perhaps not in favor of education, particularly the girls' education. अगर हम इशारों में बात करें तो बहुत सारे और भी ग्रुप्स हैं जो चाहते हैं ब्लाइंड ओबीडियंस, जिनकी हायरार्की चाहती है ब्लाइंड ओबीडियंस, जो चाहते हैं कि लोगों को अपने राइट्स ना पता हो, जो चाहते हैं कि वेजेस वो अंडर पे करें, जो चाहते हैं कि एक्सप्लॉइट करें. None of them would want at least a critical education. They might be okay with technical education, but education that creates thinking, the education that creates empowerment, that creates freedom, that kind of education can be threat to many people. And that is why I suggest that we have to take educational challenge as a political challenge and not just as a technical challenge जिसको हम कुछ technical तरीकों से ऐड करें. And look at history. All the grand transformations, चाहे slavery की abolishment हो, चाहे women's rights के लिए suffrage हो, चाहे feminist movements हो, civil rights movements हो, decolonial movements हो, anti-apartheid movements हो, these were all movements that had political dimension. Because in those societies, there were powerful groups who did not share the objectives. And therefore, these movements were not just technical movements, they were political movements. And my third point, therefore, is that we will have to take the struggle that we are doing, the challenges that we are facing, as political challenges and not just as technical challenges. So if I summarize the 3 points that I want to propose, one, I think to do this systemic move, we'll have to have a body with people from around the country, thought leaders, thinkers, practitioners, with a commitment from across the political parties and across the institutions that have powers, that we will let this group come up with ideas, projects, practices, challenging, as you were saying, the very fundamentals that need to be challenged, and a commitment that those recommendations will be put in place. Second, that we have to be careful that we need an education that is education of the heart, an education of the soul, and education of the mind, so that we end up creating good human beings who happen to be good in every other things as well. And thirdly, that we need to see our challenge as a political challenge. My friends, education is a very strange kind of activity. And its challenges are also very strange because, you see, what are we expected as an educationist? We are expected to prepare the young for tomorrow, for future. And by definition, none of us knows what the future will be, especially today. So we are preparing something for an unknown. We just do not know what is around the corner. इसमें सिर्फ एक ही एडवाइस हो सकती है, वो ये कि we recognize that children are not our property. That children are not our extension. It is not right to force them to acquire a particular identity. It is not right to force them to be familiar with only one kind of history. It is not right to force them to be familiar with only one kind of doctrine. We have to see them as individuals. We have to see them as people for tomorrow. And our work is simply to prepare them, facilitate them, give them exposures, not to make them like ourselves, but to let them be whatever their time will make them. खलील जिब्रान की एक ज़बरदस्त पोइम है द चिल्ड्रन के नाम से, जो उनकी बुक प्रॉफिट में है. उसमें वो कहते हैं, your children are not your children, they are children of time. I think this is a very powerful message that every educationist and those who are making policies of educationists need to keep in mind. Thank you very much.